Imagine you have to perform surgery on the most powerful man in the world, the king. Now imagine that the operation needs to be performed on his backside. One wrong move and your head would roll, and the necessary tools for such an operation simply didn't exist. It was 1686. The Sun King, Louis XIV, could no longer sit on his throne. Literally. He suffered from an anal fistula, simply put, a festering channel that caused unbearable pain. It was painful, humiliating, and mortally dangerous. Any infection could kill the monarch. France's best physicians had tried everything: poultices, ointments, prayers. Nothing worked. The king writhed in agony, while all of Versailles pretended nothing was amiss. Then, in desperation, they remembered a man named Charles-François Félix. He was not a scholarly physician. He was a barber-surgeon, a craftsman who worked with his hands and knives. He was entrusted with a task no one else in the world had ever attempted: to cut into the living body of God on earth. This was an era when surgery was not considered medicine, but a crude, dirty craft. Physicians in powdered wigs wrinkled their noses in disdain. Cutting people open? Perish the thought. That was work for bone setters and barbers who trimmed beards yesterday and amputated limbs today. Surgery meant screams audible down the street. There was no anesthesia. Patients were simply tied to a table or held down by 4 strong assistants. No one sterilized instruments. Germs hadn't even been conceived of. Pus was considered a good sign, a mark of healing. Surgeons worked in their ordinary frock coats, splattered with the blood of previous unfortunate patients. 9 out of 10 patients died not from the knife, but from blood poisoning days later. And under such conditions, a delicate, precise operation had to be performed on the human body's most sensitive and, arguably, dirtiest area. It wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. For Charles-François Félix, this suicide had a very specific face: his own. He was no court intriguer or Sorbonne scholar. He was a third-generation craftsman, a man whose fingers were accustomed to the steel of a scalpel, not the silk of gloves. His world was the screams of patients and the smell of blood. And into this world, Versailles intruded. When the king's chief physician informed Félix of this immense trust, he went cold. He instantly understood it wasn't an honor, but a trap. Refuse, and his head would roll for disobedience. Accept and fail, and his head would roll for assassinating God's anointed. Either outcome led to the gallows. The fear of the entire court, the monarch's agony, now converged on one single point: him. And Félix did what any good craftsman does when faced with an impossible task. He demanded time, 6 months. He also demanded money from the royal treasury. And people. Dozens of people suffering from the same ailment as the king. Thus began the strangest hunt in French history. The monarch's agents scoured Paris hospitals, asylums, and prisons in search of unfortunates with anal fistulas. They were brought to Versailles. 75 people became living mannequins for the surgeon. Félix locked himself in his operating room and began to rehearse. Again and again, he incised festering wounds, made mistakes, maimed, and sometimes even killed. He broke old instruments. He drew blueprints for new ones himself, a curved scalpel with a silver tip designed to protect tissues from accidental cuts. He honed every movement, every incision, until it became automatic. 6 months of screams and blood. By the end of that period, he was ready. He knew the anatomy of the royal posterior better than his own. On November 18, 1686, at 7 in the morning, the king's bedchamber was transformed into an operating room. Louis lay on his stomach, at the edge of the bed, facing the pillows. He was perfectly calm, or so it seemed. Beside him, pale as sheets, stood his chief physician, War Minister Louvois, and his secret wife, Madame de Maintenon. She clutched the monarch's hand. The room was so silent that the crackling of logs in the fireplace was clearly audible. Félix entered. In his hands he carried a velvet case containing his hard-won instruments. He neither bowed nor spoke. He simply approached, nodded to 2 strong assistants, who then pressed down on the king's shoulders and legs. Then the surgeon drew his curved scalpel. Its silver tip gleamed coldly in the morning light. And without a single word of warning, Félix made the first incision. A muffled cry escaped, immediately swallowed by the pillow. The great royal fistula was opened. The operation lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of steel scraping bone, muffled groans, and the smell of burnt flesh. But as Felix cut and stitched, another battle was brewing beyond the royal bedchamber doors. His success would be a humiliation for the entire scholarly world. For the Sorbonne professors who had prescribed useless poultices for the king for months. For the entire Collège de Saint-Côme of surgeons, who saw Félix as an arrogant upstart, a mere barber blessed with blind luck. Poisonous whispers spread through the corridors of Versailles. They claimed he hadn't healed, but tortured those 75 souls in his Versailles slaughterhouse. That the king would die not from his ailment, but at the hands of this Parisian butcher. Every precise incision of Félix's scalpel was a slap to their reputation, and they prepared to strike back. But they miscalculated. While conspiracies brewed in the corners of Versailles, a miracle unfolded in the royal bedchamber. The king did not die, not a day later, nor a week. The wound, which everyone expected to fester, began to heal, cleanly, without fever or infection. By January 1687, Louis was not merely sitting on his throne again, he was riding his horse in his gardens. Then came the thunderclap of royal gratitude. Charles-François Félix received 300,000 livres, a vast fortune. He was granted a noble title and an estate. But his greatest triumph was something else entirely. The entire court went mad. Having a fistula became fashionable. Dozens of aristocrats suddenly discovered they had the same ailment and lined up for Félix. The à la royale operation, as it was dubbed, became a mark of high status. Yesterday's barber butcher became Europe's most celebrated surgeon, while his enemies were forced to watch in silence as their reputations turned to dust. But all this fashion for fistulas was merely foam on a giant wave. The real revolution occurred more quietly, but proved far more significant. Félix's success didn't just strike at his envious rivals. It struck at the very status of the surgeon. Before him, a barber-surgeon was a second-class citizen, despised by scholarly physicians. After him, he became a savior, their equal. And the most important man in the kingdom understood this, Louis himself. He didn't just shower Félix with gold. By royal decree, he permanently separated surgeons from barbers, creating a distinct, respected caste for them. Furthermore, he founded the Royal Academy of Surgery. From then on, the best minds went there to study, not just apprentices with strong hands. One precise incision on the royal posterior lifted an entire profession from the bottom to the top. Surgery ceased to be a dirty craft and became a royal science. And Félix himself? He lived a long and prosperous life, but he never became an important scholar in a powdered wig. To his dying day, he remained what he had always been, a craftsman. And therein lay his main secret. While the best minds of France read ancient treatises and prayed, he simply worked with his hands. He didn't seek brilliant inspiration. He sought the right angle for his scalpel. He didn't wait for a miracle. He created it himself, repeating the same movement hundreds of times on the bodies of the poor until his hands acted faster than his thoughts. And this entire great revolution which changed medicine forever didn't begin with a grand idea. It began with a master's simple, stubborn reply to an impossible task. Give me 6 months to practice.